No? So thank you, Marcelo, and thank you for the university and the centre here for inviting me to speak. I will quickly, though, go through. So the organisation that I represent is a regional organisation. It's Israeli, but it's also Palestinian, and it's also Jordanian. And it's, in fact, the only regional organisation that exists, quite sadly, that includes our three peoples together. I'm going to give a case study on the Jordan River and the demise of that ecosystem, largely in the name of food security. Not only, but largely. And I'll explain why and what's happened, and then steps as to how things are being reversed. So the Jordan River is perhaps the most famous river in the world, for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, but also for nature. It's a shared river system, and our work at Friends of the Earth Middle East is mostly focused on the southern, from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. Part of the river is solely in Israel, and then it becomes the border between Israel and Jordan, and then the West Bank and Jordan. And that clearly complicates issues of management. The river used to have 1.3 billion cubic meters on average of water flowing down from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. It was never the Mississippi River of the United States that we saw, but nevertheless you can see when the Australian troops came across the Jordan with Allenby, you see some 17 horses crossing the Jordan River at one time, 100 meters wide. Again, the story of certainly initially Israel wanting to make the desert bloom, and the building of the national water carrier, bringing water from the Sea of Galilee all the way to Tel Aviv and then down into the desert, on the principle of making the desert bloom, something that Israel was extremely proud of, and no doubt very important to Israel's economic growth at that time. But the impact of removing water, pumping water out of the Sapir pumping station to the national water carrier meant that no water was to leave the Sea of Galilee south of Degania Dam, apart from the odd occasion of floods. And the last significant flood was 1991 and 92. But not only Israel did the same in the focus of violence and warfare, so did our neighbors. Syria building some 70 dams on the Yarmouk, the main tributary, south of the Sea of Galilee, and Jordan building the King Abdullah Canal. Here you see the Unity Dam, the Wahde Dam, on the Jordanian-Syrian border, one of many side wadis on the Jordanian side, capturing every possibility of water. And here is the last stretch of clean water on the Israeli side at Alumot Dam. Everyone in its place dumping raw sewage, because as soon as the ecosystem is destroyed, very easy to turn it into a sewage canal to deal with our waste, to turn it into our backyard. And therefore, this is the Jordan River today. This is last year. You struggle to find a river. This is in winter. You can see that this is during the winter period, not summer. It doesn't matter really how much precipitation falls in the region. Everyone has cut off water access to the river by design. In the Israeli case, again, originally predominantly for purposes of agriculture, in Jordan also for agriculture predominantly, and similarly in Syria. It also has implications on the Dead Sea. You can see the piers that were once touching the water, today 25 meters in thin air, or other piers at the northern tip of the Dead Sea, today 1.5 kilometers from where the waters of the Dead Sea. 60 to 70% of the demise of the Dead Sea is directly related to the capture of the waters of the Jordan. Some 98% of those waters are today captured, leading to a true example of an ecological disaster. So it's in this context that Friends of the Earth Middle East, we have been leading a project for the last 7 odd years to rehabilitate the Jordan River. First of all, understand what does rehabilitation mean, or at least what does rehabilitation mean for our own organisation as a policy objective. Where could waters to rehabilitate the river come from, and how could we create political will in all of our relevant countries, at least, to reverse that situation. So like many of the work that we do, we hired external consultants for the first question to undertake an environmental flow study, Israeli, Palestinian and Jordanian experts together, who actually went down to the banks of the river, risking their lives because there are minefields along the river banks as part of the border area, to understand the current water flow, water quality, impact on botany, on biodiversity, and compared their findings with earlier reports, including going back to a very interesting book prepared by a US Navy Admiral, Admiral Lynch, that was the first, European at least, to go down the Jordan River in the 1840s on a boat. He loses one of his boats because of the rapids and the waterfalls that once existed in this river system. But the bottom line is that we've lost, according to the research that we've completed here, some 50% of biodiversity, at least in macroinvertebrates. We've completely destroyed the system, the river as a river of fast-flowing water, and all biodiversity that's dependent on that. The willow trees, something that Admiral Lynch describes along the whole banks of the river. Well, the willow tree is today extinct in the banks. And then we've had to come to make a determination as to, well, what type of river do we want to see? Because as an advocacy organisation, our role here is to bring the issue to public attention, to reverse the situation. And clearly, we would desire full restoration, but also understand that that's not possible, that there continue to be competing demands for scarce water, and we adopted a scenario in between river rehabilitation and partial restoration, and are calling for some 400 to 600 million. So between around a third to less than half of the original flow of the water, with salinity levels at a manageable level. You can see that it's attracted people to jump into the river with us. Well, these are the Palestinian, Jordanian and Israeli mayors of the Jordan Valley. They've jumped into the river with us on many different occasions because they've come to understand that they're the big losers from the demise of the river, that it's in their common interest to advocate together that the river be rehabilitated. That's part of the political will created. And we've also tried to estimate how much each country should bring back. And the bottom line is we're calling on Israel to bring back something close to half, and Syria and Jordan the other half together. And that means for Israel to bring back some 220 million cubic meters, not a small amount of water, considering water scarcity. We then undertook another study that tried to answer the question, well, where could that water come from? Because, again, as an environmental organisation, we don't think that desalination should be the immediate and only solution. We think, and I know the next presentation is going to touch on that issue, we think desalination has an important play an important role to play. But it must be in a broader bag of policy options. And we in particular took on a wedges approach of looking at supply side and demand side conservation efforts, and we looked at all three economies. And we have identified how in Israel we could actually save close to 500 million cubic meters of water without going on to desalination at prices less than desalination by undertaking different types of measures. One of them, of course, includes increasing the price of water for agriculture, particularly in areas where high subsidy, and it's areas of high subsidy, in fact, in the Jordan Valley that continue today. But also other measures that are very relevant to agriculture, covering reservoirs where some initial efforts have taken place, but there's a lot more room. Israel is a world leader in treating wastewater. There's lots of treated wastewater reservoirs all over the country. But of course we're evaporating a lot of that water because they're not covered. We could be covering those reservoirs and producing renewable energy at the same time, and making more water available for agriculture or other needs, and hence making water available also for nature. But it's not only the Israeli water economy that we looked at, we also looked at Jordan. One of the comments earlier was that indeed there's there too, despite great scarcity, tremendous amounts of inefficiencies. Water is pretty much supplied for free to farmers, 3 cents a cubic meter in Jordan, lots of room for improvement. 46, close to 100 million cubic meters could be saved in the Jordanian water economy, or better utilized in the Jordanian water economy. Even for Palestinians, we've identified some 92 million cubic meters that could be better utilized should policies of more appropriate, more sustainable policies be introduced. So in total, we identified some 914 million cubic meters that could be reintroduced, including to nature, including to the Jordan River. But we took it a step further and we hired a Dutch company called DHV that is a consultancy company. It's all over the world. It also has offices here. And we looked in more detail at the Israeli side of the Jordan River Valley, again from the Sea of Galilee, including the Sea of Galilee, to the Green Line at Bez Extreme, and looked at all of the users of water in the region, predominantly agriculture, to see how we could strike that balance, because clearly we're not wanting to close down agriculture, but we also cannot tolerate the complete demise of the ecosystem itself. And here we looked at a 30-year scenario, and it actually presents some positive possibilities as to the rehabilitation of the river, assuming two assumptions. One, that indeed policies to reduce the amount of pumping out of the national water carrier will indeed be implemented, and there is certainly that issue is certainly currently on the table. It's on the table because of desalination, which you'll hear in the next speaker. We think that it doesn't have to be so dependent on desalination only, but it could also take place because of a mixture of conservation and desalination. And it also makes assumptions as to climate change. And here we've used models that the Water Authority itself is using. So that if we look, again, according to the model prepared to us by DHV, over a 30-year period, in the first decade, we see not a great deal of changes from a policy of business as usual. But then we see a period where, because of decreased pumping out of the national water carrier, some real improvements in the water levels of the Sea of Galilee, and then 15 years on, we see long periods where there is strong potential for flooding, for water again to flow in areas in the time of period B and period C, which is beyond a decade from now. However, these findings tell us that we still, despite reduced pumping from the national water carrier, we still are unable to reach the type of sustainable flows that we're seeking, the 220 million cubic meters of water per annum with the levels of salinity that we wanted. And therefore, we've gone and identified, again, another list of wedges that can identify how we need to go further, identifying the treatment of saline waters that are currently dumped into the Jordan River, a further reduction in agricultural use in the Jordan Valley would be necessary. A 30% reduction in the use of saline water, a 30% reduction in the use of fresh water for those communities directly in the Jordan Valley. And only if we undertake all these additional measures are we able to reach our target. And here we've also costed what it means to rehabilitate the river, and it's at the cost of some 3.4 billion shekels over a 30-year period. And there's a breakdown as to what those costs involve, including loss of revenue to farmers both in the upper Jordan and in the lower Jordan. But 3.4 billion shekels over 30 years is not a great deal of money for the rehabilitation of the River Jordan. If we compare it to some of the rehabilitation schemes in other parts of the world, the Murray-Darling in the US, this is very doable. What we are currently undertaking is also a study of the economic benefits of the rehabilitation, because once those figures are plugged in, the true cost to the economy, we hope, will actually be completely positive because of the possibility of hundreds of thousands of additional pilgrims coming to be baptized into the Jordan River, other tourist opportunities that currently cannot take place because of the complete demise of the ecosystem. So there are good steps being taken place. By the end of this year, there'll be no more sewage. That earlier photo of sewage that I showed you, there's a sewage treatment plant currently being built. It'll be completed at the end of this year. There'll be no more sewage from the Israeli side. A first sewage treatment plant is also being built on the Jordanian side, and a recommitment to build a sewage treatment plant in Jericho on the Palestinian side. Again, the effectiveness of working with all three sides at the same time bears fruit. For the very first time, the Ministry of Environment has launched a master plan for the Jordan River, promoting new policies, and the European Union has given us support, in fact, close to $5 million to undertake a master plan on the Jordanian, Palestinian, and integrating the Israeli study with it. Lots of media attention has been brought to this issue. Without the media attention, there isn't the creation of political will. In fact, there'll also be a documentary movie out. It'll be released in the United States on global water issues by participant media. It includes the story of the Jordan. Later on in the year, it'll also be coming to Israel. Lots of parliamentary action, both overseas and local. The US Senate has passed a resolution calling for a striking of a balance. The European Parliament, the year before last, hearings in the Israeli Knesset, hearings in the Jordanian Knesset on this issue. Still a vision to create a peace park, the first peace park in the Middle East, on both banks of the Jordan River, at the site where a hydroelectric power station used to power 40% of the energy, produce 40% of the energy of Mandate Palestine. Of course, today, what's left in the river, a mouse wheel won't turn. But a peace park is another concrete example of economic benefits of a rehabilitated river, and a peace park speaks to the cooperation that once was in the region. In fact, the original power station was a cooperative engagement by Pinchas Rottenberg, a Jewish immigrant to Mandate Palestine, and Amir Abdallah I. And therefore, as we see it, the game is over for the old practices. The public is no longer tolerating the complete demise of ecosystems, not for food security or not for anything else, and is demanding that that a balance be struck, recognizing that food security is absolutely important, but equally recognizing that food security and everything else is dependent on maintaining a healthy environment, not just for our generation, but for all generations to come. So thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gidon, for standing your time, even less. So that's very nice. We'll have time for questions.
You didn't mention whether there be any evaluation of the possibility that the canal putting salt water in from the Red Sea, the Dead Sea will then solve the problems of the water there, and then at the water in the Jordan approach the Dead Sea, it will then be pumped back and used for agriculture, because agriculture does need water.
So the question is, what's the relevance of the Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal? So this is a major World Bank study at the invitation of our own governments to build a pipeline or tunnel, depending, to bring some 2 billion cubic meters out of the Red Sea, actually initially pump it up 200 meters, utilize the drop that then becomes 600 meters, produce energy, desalinate water. Half of it becomes drinking water, 1 billion cubic meters, therefore lots of eyes light up. And the other half is brine that would be dumped into the Dead Sea and raise the level of the Dead Sea. Well, we're very worried about that project. We're very worried about the environmental implications on the Gulf of Aqaba, particularly on the coral reefs, and on the mixing of the Red Sea waters with the unique brine of the Dead Sea. There is no other similar body of water to the Dead Sea. The fear is the creation of gypsum, that the waters of the Dead Sea could turn white in color. A draft World Bank study on that actually speaks now to the risk, the high risk of the project. The project, however, would do nothing for the Jordan River because the fresh water would go to Amman, maybe to Jerusalem, Ramallah, although it's very expensive water for Israelis and Palestinians. Might be okay for Jordanians, but Israelis and Palestinians can desalinate on the Mediterranean coast for 57 cents. The cost of this water in Amman is somewhere between $1.50 to $2 a cubic meter, so it makes no sense. And the bottom line is that, again, according to our studies, there are cheaper, more environmentally sustainable means of managing the water resources that we do have far more sensibly than continue to go down this track of trying to beat nature, trying to be so much more clever, of mixing two seas that have never mixed before. And I guess that also speaks something as to desalination. Great technology, important technology, but are we going too far in the amount of desalination that we're producing? I'm sure the next speaker is going to completely disagree with me, and therefore it's going to be great to hear him speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gidon, for your talk.